events that had taken place at the Admiral Benbow Inn, life was very quiet for me now, staying on at the Hall. The squire had departed in haste for Bristol to find a ship and crew that would take us in search of the treasure. And Dr. Livesey was in London, making arrangements for a physician to look after his practice. I was left under the charge of old Redruth, the squire's gamekeeper, who kept an eye on me at all times lest the pirates should come once more. By night, I'd sit beside the great fire in the hall and brood over all that had so recently happened. 3 men had died: the captain, for whom I'd felt pity, blind Pew, whom I had loathed, and my poor dear father. It was his death that caused me now great heartbreak and loneliness. And yet, despite my unhappiness, I could look forward to excitement. Time and again I studied that map, my mind full of sea dreams and the most charming anticipations of strange lands and high adventure. In my fancy, I explored every inch of the island. I climbed the hills 1,000 times. I committed to memory all those wonderful names: Spyglass Hill, Mizzenmast Hill, Skeleton Island, and White Rock. But in all my fancies, nothing occurred to me so strange and tragic as our actual adventures. It was 3 weeks after the departure of Squire Trelawney and the doctor that a letter came addressed to me at the Hall. It contained the news that I'd been waiting for so long to hear. Dear Hawkins, this day I write to you and Dr. Livesey, asking that you join me without delay in Bristol. The ship is bought and fitted. She lies at anchor ready for sea. You never imagined a sweeter schooner. A child might sail her, 200 tons, name Hispaniola. Come with all speed, John Trelawney. Imagine my excitement that evening when, in the company of the Loyal Redruth, I set off by the mail for Bristol. I'd said farewell to my mother, now safely reinstated at the Admiral Benbow, and I knew that the adventures I'd dreamed of for weeks were now beginning. On we raced in the moonlight through those West Country hills. I wanted to stay awake for every moment of the journey, but such was the pounding of the hooves, the rattle of the wheels, and the rocking of the coach, that after several hours I dozed off and soon fell into a heavy sleep. Poor Redruth had to shake me several times the following morning to wake me from my slumbers. Come on, lad, wake up. For weeks now you've been dreaming of tall ships and the sea. Well, take a look at Bristol. What a sight now lay before my eyes. A great multitude of ships of all sizes and rigs and nations. There were sailors singing at their work, men up aloft hanging to threads that seemed no thicker than a spider's. Though I'd lived by the shore all my life, I seemed never to have been near the sea till then. The smell of tar and salt was something new. I saw the most wonderful figureheads that had been far over the ocean. Here was life and business, the sound of lapping water, the cry of wheeling gulls. Here was the adventure, excitement, and atmosphere of a bustling port, peopled by men of the sea. Sailors with rings in their ears and whiskers curled in ringlets, with tarry pigtails and swaggering, clumsy walks. And I was going to see myself, bound for an unknown island and to seek for buried treasure. What brought me round from this delightful state was a voice that held me from along the quayside. Ahoy there, Jim Hawkins! I see you made it, lad! Bravo, for now the ship's company's complete. I turned round, and there stood Squire Trelawney, all dressed out like a sea officer in stout blue cloth. Beside him was the doctor, who only the night before had arrived on the mail from London. It did me good to be in the company of these 2 men once more. They'd proved loyal friends in the past, and their presence, in part, made up for the absence of my father. Together we walked along the quayside, past ships large and small, past sailors of all races, past cargoes bound for ports the world over. And as we did so, the squire told us of our ship, the Hispaniola, and her crew. Buying her was no difficulty at all. Got her from a friend for the merest trifle. Though at one time I thought we'd have trouble finding a crew. Then, by the greatest stroke of luck, found an old sailor who keeps a public house in Bristol. Said he'd lost his health ashore and might he join us as cook for the voyage. A wonderful fellow, engaged him on the spot. John Silver's his name, Long John Silver. Lost a leg in his country's service under the immortal Hawk. Imagine that, Livesey. Seems he knows everyone in the port, even found the crew for me. Not pretty to look at, but by their faces of the most indomitable spirit. With them aboard, I declare we could fight a frigate. Several hours later, having breakfasted well with the squire and Dr. Livesey, and heard all their news, I was dispatched with a note addressed to John Silver at the sign of the Spyglass. I was told I'd easily find the place, a bright little tavern with a large brass telescope for a sign. It was a bright enough little place of entertainment. The sign was newly painted, the windows had neat red curtains, the floor was cleanly sanded. There was a street on either side and an open door on both, which made the large, low room pretty clear to see, in spite of clouds of tobacco smoke. The customers were mainly seafaring men, and they talked so loudly that I hung at the door, almost afraid to enter. As I was waiting, a man came out of a side room, and at a glance I was sure he must be Long John. His left leg was cut loose by the hip, and under the left shoulder he carried a crutch, which he managed with wonderful dexterity, hopping about on it like a bird. He was very tall and strong, with a face as big as a ham, plain and pale, but intelligent and smiling. Indeed, he seemed in the most cheerful of spirits, whistling to himself, with a merry word or slap on the shoulder for the more favoured of his guests. Now, to tell the truth, from the squire's first mention of Long John, I'd taken a fear into my mind that he might prove to be the very one-legged sailor whom I'd watched for so long at the Admiral Benbow. But one look at the man before me was enough. After the captain, Black Dog, and the blind man Pew, this clean, pleasant-tempered landlord seemed most unlike a buccaneer. So, plucking up my courage, I crossed the threshold and walked right up to the man where he stood propped on his crutch, talking to a customer. Mr. Silver, sir? I asked, holding out the squire's note. Yes, lad, such is my name to be sure, and who might you be? Then he saw the letter, and for a moment he appeared startled, but exclaimed in a loud voice, "Ah, I see! You're our new cabin boy. Pleased I am to see you." Just then, one of the customers rose suddenly and made for the door. He was out in the street in a moment, but his hurry had attracted my notice, and I recognized him at a glance. It was the tallow-faced man wanting 2 fingers who'd come first to the Admiral Benbow. "Stop him! Stop him! It's Black Dog!" I cried. "I don't care 2 coppers who he is, but he hasn't paid his score. Harry, run and catch him. If he were Admiral Hawke, he'd pay his score." "No, lad. Who d'ye say he was? Black what?" "A Black Dog, sir," said I. "Surely Mr. Trelawney has told you of the buccaneers at the Admiral Benbow. He was one of them." "So, in my house? One of those swabs, was he? Well, lad, let's try and find out a little about him." We looked towards the corner of the room where Black Dog had been sitting next to an old, grey-haired, mahogany-faced sailor. "Morgan," called the landlord, "you never clapped eyes on that Black Dog before, did you now?" "No, sir." "By the powers, Tom Morgan, it's as good for you. Now, what were you talking about?" "About the sea and ships and captains and a bit of keel-hauling." "Keel-hauling, eh? And a mighty suitable thing, too. You may lay to that. Tom Morgan's a stupid man, but quite honest, so we need have no worry there. Now, let me see. The name Black Dog means nothing, but I think, yes, I have seen the swab before.
He used to come here with a blind beggar, he used.
That he did, you may be sure, said I. I knew that blind man, too. His name was Pew.
Indeed it was,
cried Silver, now excited.
Pew, that were his name for certain, and he looked a shark, he did. If we run down this black dog now, there'll be news for Captain Trelawney. Harry's a good runner. He should run him down hand over hand by the powers. He talked to keel-hauling, did he? I'll keel-haul him.
I must admit that my suspicions had been thoroughly awakened on finding Black Dog at the spyglass, and I watched the cook narrowly. But he was too deep and too clever for me. For when the man Harry returned and reported that he'd lost Black Dog in the crowds, Silver scolded him as he would a thief, and in doing so, convinced me of his own innocence. Shortly afterwards, I walked with Silver to find the squire and tell him of the incident. Silver proved to be the most interesting companion. He told me of the different ships that we passed by, their rig, tonnage, and nationality, explaining the work that was going forward, how one was discharging, another taking in cargo, and a third making ready for sea. And every now and then he'd tell me some little anecdote about ships and seamen, and I began to see that he was one of the best of possible shipmates. It was at the door of the inn, where the squire was staying, that Silver laid a hand on my shoulder.
Jim, lad, I've just thought. Now, what's Mr. Trelawney going to think when he hears tell our story of Black Dog? He might think it mighty strange that the swab was drinking rum under my roof. So I hope you'll do me justice with the squire, Jim. But what could I do anyway with this old timber to hobble on? There was the day when I had 2 legs and I'd have caught that Black Dog in a brace of shakes. Still, what's done is done. Let's tell Mr. Trelawney.
It was long after Long John Silver had related his tale and returned to the spyglass that I sat with the doctor and the squire supping ale. We'd fully discussed the morning's incident and were all agreed that Silver, far from being connected with Black Dog, was the most splendid man upon whom we could all rely.
The man's a perfect trump, remarked the squire. So I say, let's get on board and see the ship. I've told all hands to be on board by 4 o'clock this afternoon.
The Hispaniola lay some way out, and we went under and around the sterns of many other ships, sometimes their cables grating underneath our keel, and sometimes swinging above us. Then, as we pulled around the bows of an old merchantman, I got my first clear sight of our own vessel. And what a craft she was! The most wonderful topsail schooner, her 2 masts standing tall against the sky, the delicate lines of the ratlins tracing their way to the main and foretops. And all aboard her, such activity of which I'd never seen the like. Some members of the crew stowed cargo, others carried huge casks below, while to one side, other stores and provisions were being checked in preparation for the voyage. The captain was a sharp-looking man who seemed angry with everything on board, and was soon to tell us why. For we'd hardly got down into the cabin than he came through the doorway. "Mr. Trelawney, gentlemen, welcome aboard." It was a very cool welcome indeed.
"Oh, well, Captain Smollett, what is it?" asked the squire. "You seem out of sorts. All's well, I hope?"
"Well, sir, better speak plain, I believe, even at the risk of offence. I don't like this cruise. I don't like the men. I don't like the mate. That's short and sweet."
"Perhaps, sir, you don't like your employer, eh?"
"Oh, stay a bit, gentlemen, stay a bit," cut in Dr. Livesey. "Now, we can't have questions that produce ill feeling. The captain has said too much, or too little, and I'm bound to say I require an explanation of his words. You say you don't like the cruise, Captain. Now, why is that?" "I was engaged, sir, on what we call sealed orders, to sail this ship wherever Mr. Trelawney should bid me. But now I find that every man before the mast knows more than I do. I don't like it, sir."
"And neither do I," replied the doctor.
"Next," continued the captain, "I learn we're going after treasure. Hear it from the crew, mind you. Now, I don't like treasure voyages on any account, and especially when they're kept secret from me." The squire was visibly embarrassed. I'll admit to it, Captain, that we are after treasure, and I'd every intention of telling you. But how word got to the crew is a mystery to me. I've told not a soul. Well, someone has, sir, said the captain, for I've heard that you've a map of an island giving latitude and longitude and the exact location of the treasure. By now, the whole crew will know. So I ask you, are you determined to go on with this voyage? Like iron. We realize there'll be risks, and we're prepared to take them. But please understand, Captain, we're not as ignorant as you might believe. Very well, sir. We proceed with the voyage, but I insist on the following conditions. The powder and arms will be put here under your cabin and not kept in the forehold. And your own 4 people. We'll move them to berths here beside the cabin. Finally, whoever has the map on his person, it shall be kept a secret, even from me. It seems, remarked the doctor, that you wish us to keep this matter dark, Captain, and make a garrison of the stern part of the ship. In other words, you fear a mutiny. I deny your right to put words into my mouth, sir. But I am responsible for the ship's safety and the life of every man jack aboard. Now, do you agree to the conditions? Indeed we do, Captain, answered the doctor. Thank you, sir. Then I'll attend to my duties. Oh, one last thing, Captain, remarked the squire. What is your objection to the mate? He drinks, sir, replied the captain. And with that, he left the cabin. Trelawney, contrary to all my notions, I believe you've managed to get 2 honest men on board with you. That man and John Silver. Silver, if you like. But as for Smollett, I find him quite offensive. He's downright, un-English. We shall see, said the doctor. We shall see. It was during mid-afternoon, while the work of loading the Hispaniola continued, that Long John Silver came aboard. And what a character he looked. Dressed now in his seagoing clothes, he stood leaning on his crutch, taking in the scene on board. Under his other arm, he carried bundles of belongings. On his shoulders sat his parrot, Captain Flint.
What have you been teaching it this time?
Faces are right. Faces are right.
Obviously, Long John and his parrot were well known in the port of Bristol, for the crew called out laughingly to them both. To me, this was a sign of the good nature of the crew, to whom I'd taken a liking. So, ho, mates, what's all this then? Asked Silver of the men who were transferring the powder and the arms to the stern of the ship. They're acting under my orders, Mr. Silver, answered the captain quietly. He stood to one side, a stern look upon his face, a sharp glint in his eye. The crew ceased their wisecracking and their laughter as the captain continued. And you, my man, had better get below. Hans'll want supper shortly. And take that boy with you. I'll have no favourites on my ship. As I crept off to the galley with Long John, I assure you I was quite of the squire's way of thinking, and hated the captain deeply. All that night we were in a great bustle, getting things stowed and in their place, and boatloads of well-wishers came out to bid us a good voyage and a safe return. A good many of these merry folk were there to see the squire, for he seemed to know most all the people in the whole port of Bristol. And I never had a night at the Admiral Benbow when I had half the work. It was just before dawn when the boatswain sounded his pipe and the crew began to man the capstan bars. And as they worked, they sang that song I'd heard before.
15 men on a dead man's Yo, oh, oh, and a bottle of rum.
They sang on as the first light of dawn colored the dark sky, and the topsails billowed in the early morning breeze. I shall not relate that voyage in detail, for the day-by-day events that thrilled me were to the crew the mere routine of any ship at sea. But it was exciting. It was the last day of our outward voyage, and sometime that night or the following morning, we should sight the treasure island. The Hispaniola rolled steadily, dipping her bowsprit now and then with a whiff of spray. All was drawing alow and aloft, and everyone was in the bravest spirits. Just after sundown, when my work was done, I strolled along the deck to get an apple from the barrel that had stood there since our voyage began. But by now there was precious little fruit left, so I climbed bodily into the barrel to see what I could find. But sitting there in the darkness, and on such a warm evening, I dozed off with the rock of the ship. What brought me to was a voice. The voice of Long John Silver. And what I heard made me wide awake in an instant.
The treasure's aboard. Let the captain work us back to the trades, and then we'll strike. And what do we do with them, John? Put them in chains or set them adrift? Dead men don't talk, mateys. Dead men don't talk. We'll cut them down, every one of them. Except Trelawney, that is. He's mine. I'll ring.
I sat in the apple barrel, hardly daring to breathe, trembling with fright and wondering if I would live to tell my tale to the others. And yet, luck was with me. For suddenly, from the topmast came the call we waited for so long to hear.
And ho! I can't see it.
There was a rush of footsteps to the side and much shouting and excitement. In the midst of it, I slipped from my hiding place, dived behind the foresail, then running low, made aft for the shelter of the squire's cabin. An hour later, in the same cabin, I faced the captain, Dr. Livesey, and the squire. After I'd told them my story, they sat for a moment, grave-faced and silent. The squire spoke first. "Jim, you've acted with great courage. You're a brave lad, well done. And as for you, Captain, you were right and I was wrong. I own myself an ass, sir, and I await your orders." Captain Smollett spoke quietly and thoughtfully. "No more an ass than me, sir. No more an ass than me. But now we must take stock. Until we know the full score, we must assume the whole crew have gone over to Silver."
Then there's only we four,
remarked the squire.
plus me own servants, Red Ruth, Hunter, and Joyce.
And that was our position as the Hispaniola closed on Treasure Island. Only 7 of us and 1 a boy, so that the grown men on our side were 6 to their 19.